I'm Caroline Goulard. I have founded 2 companies in the field of data visualization. I have been working for over 10 years to build bridges between humans and data. And we are together for a new episode of The Bridge, the media of artifacts that democratizes data and artificial intelligence. Today, we are with Hanan Ouazan. Hanan, hello.
Hello.
Can you introduce yourself? Of course.
So, I'm Hanan. I am a partner at Artefact, and I am in charge of all our offerings for the group on AI and AI topics. Generative.
Can you first define for us what is an AI agent? What is agentic? Well, that's a very good question.
It's true that there are, I think, many definitions in the market. They are not all equivalent. My definition: the agent, for me, is an autonomous system that is capable of executing tasks in order to achieve a result while also being able to adapt to its environment. And I emphasize now, adapting to its environment is very important. It's what gives the agent a certain flexibility in performing the tasks you ask of it. So that's the logic of an agent. Agentic is something a bit different. Because agents, you need to be aware that for them to perform these tasks, you can do 2 things. Either you tell them exactly what to do and they do it, or you tell them what you expect from them and they figure out how to do it. Agentic is the second point. It's this ability to define what needs to be done to achieve the goal. So, really, to put the concepts in perspective, an agent does things automatically for a goal, while being aware of its environment. Agentic refers to an agent for which you haven't predefined the way to do it, and it is the agent itself that, through its thought process, identifies the optimal path to accomplish the task.
Today we are going to talk about AI, agents, artificial intelligence agents. Can you explain to us what it is? Of course.
Well, first of all, I think we need to be aware that it's the word we're going to hear the most in 2025 if we're interested in the topic of generative AI. Technically, agents are somewhat the evolution of what we've had in the last 2 years. We experienced with ChatGPT 2 years ago the first generative AI models as we know them today. And this notably allowed us to have models with which we interacted, we asked questions, we get answers. Then we had what we called assistants. So these were generative AIs that were interconnected with our systems. And that's where we saw use cases, for example, FAQs, what we call RAG use cases, where technically what we do is we take the generative AI model and connect it to data sources. And as a result, we manage to better contextualize the answers and be more precise on the topics. Now, we are reaching a third stage where AI is not only connected to information systems to respond more accurately, but is also connected to action systems. That is to say, AI is no longer just in reading mode, but also in writing mode. It can perform tasks. This agent logic is precisely about how we give AI the ability to act on behalf of its user and carry out actions for them. That's where it gets really interesting. And it's also where, in a way, we have crossed the gap to a third level. There is an interesting point also to highlight, which is this logic of RPA. We talk a lot about RPA. It's something that has existed for years. So, RPA, for the acronym, stands for Robotic Process Automation. And it's the art of automating processes by breaking down the process into a set of tasks that we sequence, and on which in the end we achieve a result. Example: I go to my bank's website or my phone operator's website and I'm asked to upload my ID. So I take a photo or a scan of my ID. The scan is uploaded. The AI will read my ID, take my first name, last name, date of birth, height, and will take this information and enter it into the bank's or phone operator's information system. So that's RPA. It's a 3-step process. So reading, extraction, insertion into the database. What happens if tomorrow I'm not a French citizen, but I'm an American citizen? But the identity document will still be different. It will probably be written in English. And so if I use the same RPA process to do this work, what will happen is that it will crash. Why? Because the RPA is not designed to read English. It's not designed for this format of identity card, and so it won't work. What we can do now with the agents is to bring this flexibility by using generative reading intelligence to adapt to these format changes, to adapt to these language changes. And so the agent will be able to say to itself, oh, look, it's written in English, but, well, name means a name. So I understand that it contains the information. And so, in a way, we will bring this additional flexibility to the RPA logic.
What is really new so that we understand, well, is it this aspect of autonomy that we are able to adapt? Is it this aspect of writing and not just reading? Is it the mix of both? No. That's a good point.
I think the writing aspect has always existed. With RPA, we could also write at the bottom of the page. What has really drastically changed is this adaptability, as you mentioned, but it mainly stems from this intelligence. It's that AI is capable of having a critical view of itself, analyzing the environment it is in, and making decisions based on that environment. RPA, what I like to say is imagine that tomorrow you're following a route in a car, you're told after 3 seconds, you turn right, after 10 seconds you turn left, after 20 seconds there's a roundabout and you continue straight ahead. If I tell you that you have to follow this route to the letter, and let's imagine that the route is not changed, you will get there without any problem. What happens if tomorrow, after 3 seconds, there's a grandmother crossing the street and you were supposed to stop, brake, or if tomorrow the city hall decides to put a speed bump in the middle of the road and so you have to brake, inevitably, all the metrics I gave you to follow the route no longer work. That's the problem with the RPA metric. It's that, in fact, it is capable of functioning in an environment that is exactly identical to what we had thought. Whereas with generative AI, in a way, what we're going to do is tell it, you know what? You follow Waze. And so if tomorrow the traffic changes, or if tomorrow something happens and alters the route, you are able to adapt. And so it's this paradigm that has changed with generative AI. It's this intelligence, this ability to adapt to the environment. And
so what's the point? Because I feel like it's extremely broad.
The use cases. Clearly, that's why it's a bit of a topic today, because it's very, very broad. I think it would be pointless to list all the use cases we can have. I like to talk about 3 major categories that I think will be really impacted by this logic of agentic. The first category, I think, is everything related to customer relations. We've seen this now, it's been around for a while, all the chatbots that can answer questions, etc. But we need to take it a step further. That means the chatbot that handles your FAQ, that's so. 2024, so 2023. Well, I'm exaggerating, but in reality, these are things we have mastered. So, today's companies are working on achieving a level of stability that is 100% perfect, etc. But these are things we know how to do. Now, what's really more interesting is if the agent or if the chatbot, is capable of being smarter than the FAQ. Example, I'm on the chatbot and I say, hello, I have a network problem. I can't get internet on my phone. And so if, instead of telling me, you know what, I'm going to check the FAQ and tell you, your number one problem might be because your settings are incorrect or because there's an incident near you and that you can't connect anymore or because you've used up all your data plan, etc. So the FAQ, what it will do is give you a list of possibilities. And then it will be up to you to explore each of the given options and form an opinion and potentially solve your problem. With the agencies, what we can do is go further than that. It's to say, you know what? I checked in the CRM what plan you had, and I saw that actually. You have a plan with 100 GB of data per month, and I see that you've used up those 100 GB. So I suppose the reason you no longer have internet is because you've switched to limited bandwidth, and therefore you're not getting a good signal anymore. You see, this ability of the agent to access different systems, to think, to make a decision, and even to suggest to you to say, if you want, you can upgrade to the 120 GB plan, or for this month, if you think it's an exception, pay $2 to get an additional 5 $, and therefore, for this month, you won't be penalized. And so, consequently, for example, to tell you if you choose option number 1 or option number 2 to update your contract. You see, it's really the next step where, in a way, we can go even further in the customer relationship. That's the first topic. Obviously, there are other aspects of the customer relationship. I'll go over this quickly. But for example, assisting the agent who takes the call to help them solve the customer's problem. We can also do very interesting things. Analyze calls that have taken place in the call center afterwards, and propose improvements to, for example, reduce volume in the long term. These are also things we can do. There are a lot of use cases during the customer relationship. I illustrated why with the host chat because I think it's the most illustrative, but there are plenty of things to do. The second category, which is also very interesting, is what we call the back office. The back office includes all the jobs that, in fact, today involve processing that happens somewhat behind the scenes in many companies. So the example that I like to tell about this is, for example, you are someone who wants to buy a property. And so you apply for a loan from your bank to actually get a mortgage. And so what happens when you go through a digital process in general is that you go to the bank's website, you fill in information, you provide, for example, your 3 payslips, your contract, your electricity bill, proof of residence. For certain loans that exceed certain amounts, you sometimes even have to provide blood tests. In short, a certain amount of information that is then analyzed in the back office by people who will review all the information, check that it is correct, and that the information matches properly. Then they will use credit simulation software, take all the information, simulate it, make you an offer, and then send you an email to tell you either it's refused. And then, however, you don't know why, or they tell you, actually it's accepted and here is the rate. And in fact, this whole process takes time because someone has to, first of all, obviously, they don't just have your credit application on time, they have many. And on top of that, they have to take all your documents. It can sometimes be 10 pages that are needed. Read, scrutinize, fill in, manually enter into software, simulate. Understand why the simulation is good or not. Good. Have a critical view, etc. Roughly speaking. It can take, 4 or 5 days just to get a response. And in the meantime, you're waiting and you don't know whether or not to make an offer to your seller. Well, tomorrow, with generative AI, we can imagine a completely different process. You upload the various documents, the AI comes in, it reads the different documents, it extracts information, it interfaces with the simulation system, it performs simulations, it tells you yes or no. If it tells you no, it explains why. It gives suggestions to do better, and if it tells you yes, it says, you know what, if you have this rate, but if you increase your contribution from 15,000 to 22,000 euros, you drastically reduce your credit rate because you've reached a certain threshold. You see, it's completely different. One, you've reduced the time, but you can go from 4 or 5 days to, in reality, let's say about 20 minutes, 32 minutes for it to process. Obviously, you'll have your answer within 24 hours because there will be an agent. A human who will review and analyze all that, but the time has still been drastically reduced. And 2, you've gone even further than the current process because when you have a rejection, you explain why, something that doesn't happen all the time. You provide suggestions for a better application. And even when you get a positive response, you offer improvements to achieve an even better rate. So, this is typically the kind of process we're looking to somewhat automate with the agents. And finally, the third category is all the use cases around software development as well. We'll talk about it again, I think, later on. But it makes sense to say today, with these AIs that are capable of coding, of deploying things in production, how we can drastically change tomorrow the way my company develops its software, develops its projects, its use cases. And so there's an entire profession, a bit of the developer's role, that is being rethought around these AIs. And it really promises a lot of things.
What are the main categories of agents? Is there a classification? Do they have little names, different complexities?
Well, yes, that's a very good question. There are several categories of agents. I like to group them into 3 levels. really based on their level of autonomy. Let me explain. Level 1 is what you see a lot of today in the markets. It's what you see in tools like Copilot. These are agents, what we call prompt agents. So basically you give them a prompt, so a rule of the game. They do 1A an order. That is to say, you are an agent that does this, that, this. You have access to this information, to this PDF, to this information system, to Google Drive, to SharePoint, to whatever you want. And you will help me answer these questions, etc. So it's an agent that, in fact, what it does is it comes to automate tasks by breaking down the task into many small steps, which will then allow you to automate certain things. But we are really at the task level, so we automate tasks. I will provide you with an ID and you will extract the information and put it into a database. It's a task. 3 steps, as we explained earlier. There you go. This is what we see a lot today in the market. It's the most common. It's great, but in reality, when you automate a task, well, you've automated a task. It allows you to go faster on the task, but it doesn't change your day. Because in reality, today, if we really want to redo things, we need to redo processes, not tasks. And so the question arises of how I can automate processes and no longer tasks. That's where we really have the second level, which is what we call workflow agents. And it's also there, in this workflow agent, that we somehow bring in what we mentioned earlier about RPA 2.0. That is to say, I take a process as an RPA and I come to completely automate it with agents. What this will allow is to really assemble the different tasks. So you see, we take the first concept, but we make it a chain, and we move from an initial state to something that is a completed process. And so we go a step further than level 2, and we bring, compared to RPA, much more flexibility, as we mentioned earlier, with the example of, for instance, the entity document. It's in English, it's not in French. So that's level 2. The limitation of levels 1 and 2 is that for it to work, I, as a human, must explain in detail to the AI what it needs to do. I have to tell it, first you'll do this, then that, then this, then that, and so on. To do this, you have access to this API, you have access to this information, you have access to this knowledge base, etc. The AI afterwards can have flexibility at the level of each task, as we've explained, but still it must follow a certain path that you have predefined for it. So it still provides robustness, because in a way, you have forced the AI to conform to a process that you have defined. However, you would sometimes like it when the process is not existing, or when the process, today you find it tedious, or when the process is perhaps sometimes unclear. You would like the AI to bring a bit of flexibility. So this is where we have level 3, which is what we call, well, it's so new that there isn't really a nomenclature for it yet. I call it goal agent. So you no longer define a workflow, you define a goal. You say, you will have to do this for me. You must accomplish this task. And to do so, you have access to this knowledge base, these tools at your disposal. And then it's the agent itself that will chart its course. You see, it will no longer follow a pre-designed route, it will design it itself. So this brings a lot of flexibility, it's much more autonomous. However, in some ways it's also much less robust, because if tomorrow it takes a wrong route, or it diverges or whatever, in fact, there's a process that doesn't go very well, you can't do anything, and it can get stuck. When we know, and this is the important point, that these agents, somewhere behind, easy it is. To function, they rely on generative AI models, and these models are ones you pay per use. An agent that is autonomous in how it uses the models is autonomous in how it consumes. So, there. Watch out for the bill. So, this is where it's not obvious. This is also why it's a system and a level that is still not widely exploited today. It's still very much in the research stage. It will bring a lot of flexibility in the future, but it still requires a bit more control and a bit more trust today. Precisely in this ability to do things on its own, without having to define the steps to follow somewhere.
No, this topic is still new. And for me too, I find it hard to fully imagine. Basically, are we talking about an agent an AI agent that will be super competent to the point of defining its own processes? Or is it by assembling several agents that we achieve that result?
Well, that's a very good question too. Today, if you will, it's a bit like in a company. We often say I'm looking for a 5-legged sheep. So first, it's complicated to find. And second, the 5-legged sheep, in the end, it gets sore because if it does a lot of things, it's complicated. So logically, the way we create agents, the best practice is to say when you have processes that are very specialized, what you do is you set up what we call an orchestrator agent. So it's the project manager, the manager, who has an overall view of the process, who understands well how things work, and is able to allocate the different subtasks to very expert agents. So in fact, you have a sort of project team with an orchestrator agent, expert agents. And the role of the orchestrator agent is to, you see, streamline the process, assign tasks to everyone, and wait for feedback from each one. Parallelize certain tasks when they can be parallelized. You see, sequence them when they can be sequenced. And then get the right answer. Now, after all that, well, it remains under the paradigm we mentioned of whether this orchestrator agent and this expert agent, should I hard code them at the beginning, give them the steps to follow? Or should I just talk to the orchestrator agent and say, hello, you have access to all these agents, you have access to all these tools, figure it out, and then it serves you its work. So, as we explained, there are different levels. Today, we are more focused on the part. Workflow, meaning you still provide the steps, but obviously today and tomorrow, there are frameworks that exist. You can talk about Crew, AI, AutoGPT. These are things that exist and do that, but for me, they are still not suitable for production use in a business environment.
You know, it's funny, we quickly start to humanize them, these agents, comparing them to project managers and all. And it echoes the recent statement by NVIDIA CEO Jensen Huang, who said that IT directors would become somewhat like HR directors for these AI agents, these new digital workers. What do you think about that?
At first, I found it very funny. Quite visionary, though, because it raises real questions. When we think of an agent, we think of AI. When we think of AI, we think of code. When we think of code, we think of IT. So we wonder if tomorrow, if all my business processes are agents, isn't it IT that will manage all that? I think it's important to keep in mind that an agent is about automating a process. A process is something related to business. So if tomorrow you say it's up to IT to manage a business process, in a way you've misunderstood the role of IT. And the other problem also, and I think it's interesting, is that if tomorrow all the processes had to go through IT and had to be managed by IT, there's a real question of scale that arises. If tomorrow your company has 1,500 people and I tell you, you know what, HR, tomorrow we're going to multiply the size of the company by 10, reaching 15,000 people. Your first reaction is to recruit people to manage all these new employees. It's the same. We're not going to say, now there are agents, I'm going to multiply the size of my IT by 10, because we're going to have thousands of agents everywhere. So it raises two questions. And it reflects the fact that, one, having a T, which is the HR of the company, is not desirable, and it's not necessarily desired either. And so, to ensure it doesn't happen like that, or at least not only like that, we need to rethink how agents will be managed over time. That means, as we've said, an agent is a business process. That means it automates things that are business related. So if tomorrow the agent doesn't work well, IT might not necessarily have the answer. IT will tell you, I don't understand your chatbot on the site. It responds, I ask a question, it answers. Now, if the answer is not correct, it's not IT's job to know why. It's up to the business to know why the agent is not responding correctly. And so it necessarily requires acknowledging that there is now a part of the maintenance of applications. When we think of maintenance, we really think of IT, but a part of the maintenance of applications will have to be escalated to the business side. And so it will be up to the business to analyze. The chatbot, understand what the chatbot says, detect when the chatbot says nonsense and potentially correct it. I take the example of the chatbot, but it applies to all the agents you can create. And so it's important, I think, to train the business teams on these issues. and also to provide them with the right tools. Because for the business teams to be able to diagnose and debug an agent, they need to have the means to understand where it doesn't work. And at that point, potentially mobilize the data teams, the ML teams, etc. But then to react to her quote, I find it really interesting. It raises a real question. And it's clear that perhaps in terms of recruitment for the HR department and in terms of the purely administrative aspect of the department, HR, it will be IT that takes on that role. But career management and the life cycle of employee agents, I think it will be more up to the business to start maintaining that with, of course, the right tools that need to be implemented.
Because there's another thing when we start talking. In HR, we also hear about company culture. Is there a topic on training these agents so they can respond within the company in a way that they are adapted to the code, to the culture, of course?
Of course, we worked with one of our clients on precisely a chatbot, rather an HR agent, who is supposed to help employees with onboarding. And so obviously there was a huge amount of work, huge on how I give this agent the brand's tone, how I am able to ensure that it is not something very cold. So if you want to automate a process, which is often a human process, you have to be extremely careful that this process does not degrade, that this automated process does not degrade the experience. If tomorrow you have a company and you create a chatbot on your website, it must respect your tone. It cannot be cold and impersonal. Otherwise, somewhere, you have sacrificed your brand image on the altar of productivity. And that's not necessarily what was intended. Today, these agents are capable of doing that. They are capable of integrating this company culture logic, but obviously it's a task that needs to be done.
We've been quite interested in agents, but if we now return to real human workers, what is the perspective for them? And before saying that we're going to replace them all, first, how does it change their way of working?
Well, I don't think we're going to replace them all. It's very important to keep in mind that it's a bit like the Industrial Revolution. When we had the Industrial Revolution, there was a real issue that arose about saying, now I'm putting lots of machines in my factories. And so inevitably, the people who were on the assembly line and working were somewhat replaced by these machines. But these machines and the productivity gain they brought also raised new problems, or rather new questions. The first question is, how do I monitor these machines? How do I ensure they are working correctly? How do I ensure that what is produced by these machines meets the specifications and standards we have defined? When it's a human agent, in a way, they make it, they look at it. But when it's a machine, naturally, you don't have 100% confidence in it, so you want to have a quality process. So this creates additional jobs. In a way, people who were previously responsible for building will tomorrow be responsible for evaluating. The second point is that it's always the same. When we gain productivity in general, we do more things. There is time to do more things. To do more things, you need people who think about what to do. So in a way, when you spend less time on executing tasks, you have more time to spend on designing the tasks to be executed. So you still have people who will become process architects tomorrow and who will have to rethink how things work and perhaps create new processes. Typically, as we discussed earlier, when you create agents and those agents automate processes, your goal is not to take the human process and automate it. You shouldn't do that because otherwise the human process includes waiting 2 days to receive the email from HR. You don't need that when you're doing the same thing. And so there's a logic that arises to say, okay, how do I redefine the process in the era of AI and agents to somehow do it better? And thus, 2 new tasks arise as immediate corollaries. And I'm not even talking about all the tasks that will come and that we might not have thought of right away, but the task of quality. So how do I evaluate, supervise, and monitor all of this? And the task of process design. And so I think that in the future, people will have tasks that are, I believe, much more intellectual and also much more focused on control, efficiency, and the evaluation of this automation that we have implemented.
And if we look at the people who develop software, we touched on this a bit earlier, But concretely, to what extent does it change the way we create software today?
That's a very good question. I think there are several angles to it. The first angle, which we mentioned earlier regarding code, is that when I develop software today with tools like these, it allows me to develop faster. You know, in all software, there's the same syndrome as for journalists. There's the blank page syndrome. It's extremely complicated to get started. When you're coding, I was a data scientist in my younger years. I'm not that old, but when you're coding, the hardest part is to start your code. So writing the first lines, deciding where to begin your process, where to start your work. And so with these ideas today, you can very quickly bootstrap, meaning start the first version of your project. Obviously, it won't be perfect, but it immediately gives you a first draft, a first attempt that you can improve upon. So in terms of software, this already allows for a huge gain in productivity. The second point is that, in fact, when you create software, often you receive user feedback. And it takes time to integrate because you first need to ensure how you incorporate this feedback somewhere, whether it is relevant or not. And once you've integrated it, how you assess that the feedback does not cause damage or harm to the rest of your software's features. So, with these generative ideas, you'll already be able to bootstrap ideas more quickly, thus integrating ideas more easily, meaning, can I do it here, here, here? What happens if I do it here, 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 here? And secondly, you'll also be able to conduct impact studies much more efficiently and simulate the incidents it might cause on your software. So both in the design phase and in the lifecycle phase, the evolution of your software, you'll move much faster. So actually, that's the first point. It's just the software development. It changes the game. The second point, which is very interesting, is to consider that today, software has been designed for human use. The example, you see, I would love that. Next Friday, let's imagine I'm not working and I tell Leah, you know what, I'm not working on Friday. I'd like to go on a long weekend with my wife. I have a budget of 900 euros. I'd like to go somewhere less than 2 hours from Paris. I want a place where there's sunshine and I'd like to do extremely relaxing activities, unwind, visit, etc. And then there's probably a need, meaning, okay, I'm going to look at all the destinations that are less than 2 hours from Paris. I'll check by plane and by train. I'll filter for places where it's warm, where there's sunshine. Then I'll look for places where there might be, I don't know, a spa or things like that, and maybe potentially a significant focus on culture. And then it will suggest to me, you know what, you can go to Lisbon, you can go to Prague, you can go to Corsica, you can go here and there. If you choose this option, here are the activities to do. Here's the hotel I suggest, here's the flight I suggest, and the budget for each of the options. Then I say, very well, option number 1 in Prague suits me perfectly. Can you then make the reservation? So the AI automatically makes the reservation. To do this, you have to imagine that the AI will connect to APIs of different software. Potentially, if there are no APIs, it would simulate clicking on Windows to be able to do all that. It's laborious, it's not easy at all. If tomorrow we want all these automation systems to work better, we also need to rethink how agents will have to interact with the software. And so there are many things being implemented currently. For example, an interesting thing is Anthropic, which has shared a protocol called MCP. It's a protocol they want to make standard for everyone, and it will be a protocol that redefines the notion of API. I'll give you an example. This easy company. I created an agent that potentially helps me find information when I have questions. And so this agent is connected to my Google Drive, my SharePoint, and my Confluence. So when I ask a question, what happens is that the agent will query each of the systems independently by connecting to each of the APIs, respecting the protocol of each API, retrieving all the information, and then, with a critical eye, analyzing everything and making a synthesis. It's extremely laborious. If I have to create this agent, I need to first connect it with the different APIs, write the different APIs, the correct code to connect with the various APIs, and then create this loop of self-reflection to synthesize all that, have a critical perspective, etc. So I'm not saying it's impossible, I'm saying it's laborious. And if tomorrow I want to add a fourth system, it's the same all over again. So Anthropic thought of something. They wondered if we shouldn't reinvent the API so that in fact all the systems in the world speak the same API. And so when tomorrow I am an agent, I will connect to a system, well, I follow the same protocol as everyone else, and it's the same way of communicating, so it goes much faster. It's a bit like in the working world, we all speak English by default in theory. And so, in a way, when I address a client, I don't know what language they speak. I will speak to them in English. I'm sure they will be able to respond. It's the same logic, you see. And so, in a way, we have to think about redesigning systems so that tomorrow we can integrate this automation and do it much more efficiently. That's the second point for software auditors, websites, etc. And the third point is also to ask the question of what is the SaaS of tomorrow? I'll exaggerate, but a SaaS is 3 layers. It's a UX. It's intelligence, the workflow that the SaaS accomplishes, and then the data that is manipulated through this SaaS to carry out these workflows. We said that the UX tomorrow will evolve because, firstly, people will automate tasks, so there might not even be any direct interaction. And secondly, potentially, they won't automate it, but they will interact with an interface like Gemini or ChatGPT or Cloud, so chat, and thus the UX of the company, or rather the UX of the software, will be used less and less directly. And so, in a way, this weakens one of the fundamental pillars of a SaaS, which is the UX, the way of designing user journeys. On the other hand, you have the intelligence that today makes the software valuable. You use it because there is intelligence that automates tasks, but which today is very limited to the software. This means that if I want to automate a business process tomorrow, that process doesn't generally depend on one software. It depends on 10, 15 software applications. So if tomorrow the automation logic is found within the software, each software will have its own agent, and it will be a hassle to orchestrate each of the agents with its own language, etc. The agent needs to be taken out of the software because the goal of automation is to be cross-software. And so the intelligence, in a way, indirectly will shift outside of the software. So we have the UX that is no longer very interesting and the intelligence that is partially shifted outside of the software. And then there's the data on which generally the publisher has worked extensively to have a good data model. But in reality, it's a data model that contains your data. In this world where the UX is less useful, the intelligence makes less sense within the software and the data is only a third. I don't know. I don't know how SaaS should evolve tomorrow, how SaaS should perhaps interconnect with other systems to have much broader open protocols. To say my agent, I created in this software or in that software, but they can communicate with each other. It's the same communication protocols. So you see, real questions arise about the openness of software and what it will imply for their business model, for the companies that use them, and especially for this vision of automation that is cross-software. So I don't have the answer. There was a great podcast recently released in which Satya also questions the interconnection of tomorrow. You see, his example is to ask whether tomorrow Apple will allow me to automate things with Office Copilot on the iPhone. You see, it's a real question because it would mean that Apple gives the right to internal software to automate things within its hardware. All these questions arise, and the SaaS business and the vision of SaaS for tomorrow, I think, must evolve, if only because of this point and the 2 others we discussed just before.
So let's just imagine there are perhaps some UX designers listening to us. Do you see any reassuring prospects for them at this time?
Well, of course. You see, I always exaggerate because obviously I'm projecting into the future. And to project, you need a wall. So there has to be a wall somewhere. So naturally, when you hear that, you think, oh, well, wait, all jobs are going to disappear, etc. No. We still need UX because there are many things for which today it's better to have a UX. You see, your iPhone is full of applications. You have Siri on your phone, you might have JVT on your phone, but there are things you do on an app because it's faster to do it that way. So, I'm not saying that UX will disappear tomorrow. I'm just saying that tomorrow, UX will evolve to no longer be the only entry point of an application. And so, it's mainly for the publishers that we ask the question rather than for the people who do UX. Then, an important point as well is that UX is not just about input, it's also about reading. For example, when you read a news application, you read, you don't input, so you don't need an agent to read. The question of how you read and the UX of reading still arises. That's the first point. Second point, so what I advise those who are doing UX today is to take an interest in these tools for automating code creation, which will allow them to spend much more time on deep UX thinking rather than on how to code. And there, the UX itself, in fact, And so, in a way, we take a step back, as I mentioned earlier, and adopt more of an architect's logic of UX, a designer of UX, rather than implementers of UX. And that's where there's a real paradigm shift. And so these people tomorrow, we expect them to do even better things. Because if they spend less time coding, we hope that the experience as a result will improve in quality because there is more time to dedicate to it. Perhaps my advice for them is to take an interest in these tools, in code automation, because tomorrow it will allow them to be even better and more relevant in the experience they wish to bring to their UX.
So, where is the market today at this point in time regarding these agents?
Well, the market today, if I go over the 3 levels a bit, is very focused on level 1, which is Copilot. At level 2, we are seeing things today concerning workflows. At level 3, not at all. It's still far too experimental. What we are seeing a lot of recently, however, are agents that are called perceptive agents. So, I didn't mention this earlier because I don't want to confuse the issue. There is a lot of vocabulary. But let's remember one point, which is that for the agent to truly become intelligent in the future, it must not only interface with APIs. In the future, this agent must also be able to interface with UX. I'll give you an example. Tomorrow, if you have software that has an API to interact with the software, if you are within that, your software, and you use the API to interact with it, you will quickly be limited. Why? Because an API is designed to interact with the software from outside the software. It's a bit like if you and I were doing this interview over the phone while we're next to each other. An API is the phone. It's designed for communication when we're not next to each other. When we're in the same room, it's more efficient to talk directly. It's the same with UX. They are designed to have more functionalities than APIs. And so, if agents tomorrow want to deeply interact with software, they need greater capabilities than just interfacing with the software's API. And that's where solutions like the one recently proposed by Ash come in, the startup that raised over 200 million euros in seed funding. They offer agents that are not only capable of analyzing APIs and thus have LLMs that connect and all that, but are also capable of having vision lessons, so they visualize UX and interact with these UX accordingly. So there will be a major focus on the perceptive agent, the agent that not only interacts with its environment, but also visualizes its environment and interacts based on its visualization. I think that's going to be a huge project in 2025. And notably, there are many promises today about having GPT chats or Geminis that will interact with your Mac or PC. And so inevitably, these technologies will need to understand what's happening on your screen. And so this is where we will have this concept of a perceptive agent, which I think will be an important topic for the future. Another topic, which I also think we need to keep an eye on, is this concept of technological building blocks for professions. We talked about it earlier with Jensen, the CEO of NVIDIA. If tomorrow professions need to take into account part of the maintenance of applications, well, I think they should also have suitable tools for that. And so, the logic of how I build trust in AI, how I build trust in what I implement, how I set up the right supervision tools, especially for professions, well, a market is going to develop around that. This market already exists today for IT, for data scientists, but not for professions. So there you go. There are still many things to put in place. And I think it's also going to be a major trend topic for companies. And finally, I'm thinking of a much more profession-oriented topic that is also very interesting, which is the logic of governance. Tomorrow, I provide Copilot or Workspace Gemini to all my employees. They will create agents everywhere. How do I manage that? Can you imagine if tomorrow I gave all employees the ability to recruit whoever they want with artifacts? It's going to be, I don't even have words to remain polite, but it's horrible. So, if tomorrow we want to give people the ability to recruit whoever they want to assist them, we still need to have some kind of governance and control over who we recruit, how we recruit, and ensure we don't recruit for the same position twice, etc. So, there is a logic of governance that will be put in place, because in a world where agency and agents will become commodities, what are the business processes they will implement to still maintain control over all this?
Do you already have some feedback? Some insights from the field on mistakes to avoid or best practices?
The mistakes to avoid, I think, are believing that it's magical. In fact, this is where it becomes quite divisive, because all these technologies have shown that we can do things very quickly. But these are things that work, but they don't function. That means the demo goes really well, but when you put it into production, it's immediately terrible. Because it's expensive, because it says nonsense, because it hallucinates, etc. Because it takes too long due to latency, etc. So what I advise companies is, first of all, to ask the right questions about how they are going to industrialize all this. Doing POCs just for the sake of doing POCs is pointless. And in a world where POCs are cheaper and done faster, we might be tempted to do a lot without worrying about tomorrow. So I'm not saying that we shouldn't do a lot of them. We need to test, experiment, but we absolutely must establish the fundamentals so that we can industrialize tomorrow. This involves the governance logic we mentioned earlier, which is very important, and also the platform logic that will allow us to support these use cases tomorrow, to monitor the use cases, to supervise them, to manage costs, manage latency, etc. Many very important concepts in production that are often, I think, neglected when starting a project.
To project a little into the future, we're already quite ahead of the future. But how do you see the sector evolving in the coming years?
That's a €1 million question, or even more. I think that we will have more and more reflection on these processes, because the promise of generative AI was really the promise of gaining efficiency, productivity, and what we've managed to do so far is more about reducing the duration of tasks. We haven't yet reduced the process time. So actually, this is where there's an interesting paradigm, which is that what we've managed to do over the years is that for a process that takes 2 weeks, each task takes less time, but the process still actually takes 2 weeks. Tomorrow, when we manage to overcome this milestone of digitalization, we will truly move from a 2-week process to a 2-3 day process. So that's where we will really see, I think, real productivity gains, and that's where we will notice real changes in the way we work, collaborate, etc. So I think the future will be very focused on this automation of processes, with obviously all the questions we've raised, questions about work, societal questions, software questions, business model questions, questions about interactions between different agents, etc. I think there is a massive project coming with questions for everyone. And it is very important, I think, to have a good understanding of these concepts to build your business strategy. As a result, and consequently, prepare for a world in which the ways of interacting change, the ways of thinking change, and the ways of communicating also change. And honestly, I am very open if someone has the answer. But there are still many uncertainties.
It's funny because what you just described, in the end, we've already experienced that with the arrival of computers in businesses. There was the arrival of computers, and at first we didn't see any productivity gains. And in fact, we saw that yes, maybe the secretary has a computer, but if the boss continues to dictate his letters to the secretary who now has a computer, we haven't changed the process and we haven't made any real productivity gains. I feel like what you just described is somewhat the same thing, but on the scale of artificial intelligence.
Exactly. Artificial intelligence is truly a revolution, and especially this concept of agency, which is as powerful, I think, if not more powerful, than what we had with smartphones, what we had with computers, what we had with the internet. Today, with each technological start, in fact, we have this small step forward where we do the same thing, but better. And then we do things differently. So for me, the answer to how we do things differently is agents. So, we're not there completely yet, but we're moving in that direction. And if I were to give perhaps another, it's something that comes to mind immediately, but I think we've had, you see, the models, the assistants, the agents, and so what is the future of that? Well, I don't want to say it's general intelligence, etc., because Terminator is nice, but it's not happening anytime soon. However, what's going to be interesting is how tomorrow I manage to integrate these AIs and these agents into robots. Autonomous cars are becoming much more concrete today when we have an agent capable of understanding, interacting with its environment, and making decisions. Before, we couldn't do it. So you see, it's also about agent logic. Tomorrow, we have to consider that if it is capable of understanding, analyzing, and being aware of its environment with its eyes. There are many things happening tomorrow in the world of robotics. You know, notably, Elon Musk talked about his humanoid robot. on which he wants to implement Grok, which is his generative model, tomorrow. That's truly it. I also think that tomorrow, let's not forget there will be uses beyond what we've discussed, potentially uses. You see, in factories or in our daily lives with autonomous cars, autonomous taxis, etc. So there you go. It's a bit more, not for right away, especially due to regulatory issues as well. But questions like these about process robotization also arise. And
So, for those who want to go further, we don't necessarily recommend Terminator, but do you have another movie? A book? A conference? Well, there are plenty of resources on the internet.
what I recommend is to be careful with FOT. Today, everyone has become an expert. It's quite tiring. So be careful about what you read, and especially don't trust everything you read either. That's the first point. The second point is, I think today we are fortunate to be in a world where the knowledge of experts is very accessible. So today, if you want a perspective on generative AI, you can listen to Jensen, you can listen to Satya, you can listen to Pichard directly. And actually, these people communicate because there is a communication challenge from the company on these issues as well. So it's interesting, I think, to know what Sam Altman thinks about the future, or what Mark Zuckerberg or Satya or Jensen think. And so they do a lot of conferences. My first source of knowledge is just these people who know more than we do, and who sometimes also indirectly give hints about their strategy. Because it's a bit like a game of connect the dots. When you listen to the conference and understand their product launches, when you understand a bit of their deployment strategy, if you can draw the line, you also understand a bit better where they want to go.
Hanan, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
I hope you enjoyed this episode. We'll see you very soon for a new episode of The Bridge.